Hey, little buddies, it's Uncle Rick from the Uncle Rick Audiobook Club, where you and I enjoy reading great books together. On today's podcast, I'll be reading a chapter or two from one of the exciting books in the club. I hope you enjoy it. Stick around at the end of the podcast, and I'll tell you how you can listen to the whole book, as well as tons of others that you are going to love.
A Visit with Uncle Rick, a podcast by Rick Boyer of Uncle Rick Audios.
Chapter 6, How George Washington Lost and Won. Although General Washington may have felt what is called a pardonable pride as he sat upon his horse, under the spreading branches of the Cambridge elm, and drew his sword as General and Commander-in-Chief of the forces of the 13 United Colonies, he knew that he had no easy task before him, but he went to work at once, as he always did when he had anything to do, and tried to make real soldiers of the farmers and fishermen and storekeepers and working men who made up the Continental Army. So well did he work, and so closely did he keep the British Army shut up in Boston, that King George's redcoats were obliged to leave the city, evacuate it, as the military word is. And in March 1776, Washington was in possession of the town in which the British had declared they would crush the rebellion and conquer the rebels. This was Washington's first success, and it showed the world that the Americans meant business, that they were not to be easily overcome by the trained soldiers and generals of King George, and that the commander of the Continental Army was a born leader of men and knew how to go to work to win. But none knew better than did that commander how hard the winning would be. His troops had yet to meet the British soldiers in the open field, and after the evacuation of Boston, England began to find out that if America was to be whipped into obedience, there must be plenty of men sent over to do the whipping. But England could not spare enough of her own soldiers, and so she tried to hire fighters from other nations. She tried to hire 20,000 Russian soldiers, but failed. Then she tried to get some from Holland, and failed. But at last she hired from certain states of Germany, called the Hesses, first 18,000 men, and then more and more until, before the Revolution was over, nearly 30,000 of these hired soldiers, or mercenary troops, called Hessians, were brought over the sea to fight in the armies of England, the free men of America. Many Englishmen were indignant at this hiring of foreign soldiers to shoot down their relations in America, and you may be sure it did not increase America's love for England. The first lot of Hessians sailed into New York Harbor in August 1776 and joined the army of Sir William Howe, who thus had a force of nearly 30,000 men to face Washington's poor little army of scarcely 10,000 men. The battle that had to follow took place at Brooklyn on Long Island on the 27th of August 1776. It was, of course, a total defeat for the Americans. It could not be otherwise. And when Lord Howe, the British general, had defeated the Americans, killed a great many, taken a great many prisoners, and driven the rest within their entrenchments at Brooklyn, he said, "Tomorrow evening we'll bring the fleet up the river, and with an army on one side of the rebels and our ships on the other, we will bag the whole army and crush the rebellion." But the trouble with Lord Howe, as with the other British generals, was that he did not understand Washington. The American leader had expected to be defeated. He knew that his troops must be drilled to an army before they could successfully face the soldiers of King George, and it was this patient courage that George Washington showed in the midst of defeat and danger all through the Revolution. That was one of the things that made him so great. So while he gathered his defeated army within the lines at Brooklyn, he saw through Lord Howe's plan to capture him, and without waiting for the too confident British general to try his plan, he determined to save his army by a retreat to New York. It was a dangerous experiment. If the British knew that he was trying to escape them, they would swarm down upon his little army and capture or destroy it. So he went to work carefully. He got together all the boats he could, marched his men about as if he meant to get them ready for a battle the next day, and then silently and swiftly got them down to the river. Here the boats, with the fishermen soldiers of a Marblehead regiment at the oars, were rowed over and over again. The fog shut them out from view, and before morning the soldiers were all ferried over, Washington crossing in the last boat. He had saved his army and showed the thing that makes a great general, knowing how to retreat as well as how to fight. For a successful retreat is sometimes quite as much a victory as is a successful battle. Now, I should stop right here, little buddies, and tell you something about this retreat from Long Island. Washington's army was saved not just by Washington's brilliance, but by an act of God. Because as people's diaries show, that was a clear day and a clear night. And if it hadn't been for that fog that set in, Washington's army would have been visible to British soldiers spying on them from spy glasses, from high places and up in trees and so forth. But God brought in a fog just at the right time to hide the movements of Washington's army as they gathered down at the boats and paddled across the river. So there was an act of God here as well as an act of wisdom by Washington. It was much the same with what follows. By this time, America had spoken. The 13 colonies, through their representatives in Congress, had declared that they would no longer acknowledge King George as their ruler, nor England as their governing power, but that they were, and of right ought to be, free and independent states. This was done in a paper called the Declaration of Independence, drawn up in Independence Hall in Philadelphia when Congress was in session, and issued on the 4th of July, 1776, a little over a month before the disastrous Battle of Brooklyn. I think most American boys and girls are dissatisfied because George Washington did not sign the Declaration of Independence. He was the greatest American. That was America's greatest deed. Why should he not have signed it? Of course, you know that he was with the Army. His duty was there and not in Congress. Of course, you know that he was with the Army. His duty was there and not in the Congress. For when he became the general of the Continental Army, he gave up his seat in Congress. But no one knows just how much he did toward bringing Congress to the action that resulted in the Declaration of Independence. He wrote and talked and argued to show the men in Congress that the colonies could not longer remain subject to England. They must be independent, he said. And though George Washington's name is not signed to the famous Declaration, he had as much to do with it as had many men who really did sign it. But when the Declaration of Independence had been signed, it meant that it must be backed up by deeds. So, though the Battle of Brooklyn was a defeat followed by a retreat, and though the world said that the colonies could never secure their independence, Washington never weakened but kept on struggling and striving, though defeats and retreats followed one another until any but the most determined leader would have been discouraged and felt like giving in. Washington retreated from Brooklyn to New York, and when the British followed him there, he retreated across the Harlem into Westchester County. Still pressed by Howe, he retreated across the Hudson into New Jersey, and finally across the Delaware River into Pennsylvania, with Howe still following him up. It was almost like a game of checkers, was it not? His army now consisted of but 3,000 men. His soldiers were ragged, his equipment poor, his situation desperate. The winter was a hard one, and so nearly lost seemed the cause of the colonies that new soldiers could not be induced to serve in the army. All this time, too, the enemies of Washington, for there were leading men in Congress and out of it who said all kinds of hard things about him and tried to have him set aside in favor of some general whom they declared was more of a fighter, were active against him. And still Washington kept silent. He was biding his time. In New York, Lord Howe said that the end was near at hand and that the rebels would give up the fight before New Year's Day, if he did not capture them before that time. And then, when no one expected it, Washington acted. He had determined upon a bold move. There was nothing more or less than an attack upon the Hessian lines at Trenton, New Jersey. He made all his preparations secretly, cautiously, and carefully. He was to cross the Delaware from the Pennsylvania side and, if possible, take the Hessians by surprise. Other soldiers were to march to his assistance from Philadelphia and from Bristol and cut off all hope of escape. And the river was to be crossed on Christmas night. It was anything but a Merry Christmas when, with 2,500 picked men, Washington came to the banks of the Delaware and tried to set his small army across. The river was filled with great cakes of floating ice. It was so cold that 2 of the soldiers were near frozen to death, and before morning came, the air was filled with icy and cutting sleet. It seemed to be the very worst time to attempt such an enterprise as Washington had determined upon, So bitter was the night indeed that the other generals who had been ordered to march to his support gave it up because they did not see how he could cross the icy Delaware. But Washington crossed the Delaware, and at 8 o'clock the next morning his ragged, half-frozen soldiers attacked the village of Trenton, in which the Hessians were stationed. He drove in their pickets, surrounded their camp, fought them through the town, killed their commanding officer, and captured nearly all of them, though some 500 or so managed to get away. Then, with his 1,000 prisoners, Washington recrossed the Delaware, and the long spell of failure was broken. The brilliant deed he had done paralyzed the overconfident British, put new life into the suffering cause of liberty, and so inspired the colonies that, where men had been unwilling to risk their lives for a failing cause, they were now ready to join one which seemed to promise success. Washington had saved the Revolution. From the fight at Trenton dated the steady march toward victory. That sharp and successful fight, too, showed how great a general was Washington. The retreat from Brooklyn had been one proof of this, but that was a retreat. The capture of the Hessians at Trenton showed him to be a leader who could attempt the most daring move, and, once attempted, could push it through to the end, though everything seemed against him. The great German soldier king, whom history calls Frederick the Great, when he heard how, with a few ragged regiments, so footsore indeed that their march could be tracked in the snow by the blood from their unprotected feet, Washington had defeated and captured the European soldiers whose business was fighting and whose equipment was perfect, declared that Washington was a born soldier, and that the attack at Trenton was the most brilliant campaign of the century. Washington knew when to strike, and then he struck. In the darkest hour of the Revolution, he took the chance of defeat and death, and by a movement that gave his name strength and showed the world his ability, he secured a victory which, because of its daring, its brilliance, and its completeness, set the world to thinking and created friends and helpers for the struggling 13 colonies along the Atlantic coast of North America.
Thanks for listening to A Visit with Uncle Rick today, little buddies. That's all we have time for right now. But remember, the whole book is available on the Uncle Rick Audio Book Club at unclerickaudios.com. Why not ask Mom and Dad about joining my club today?